This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook, Lindsay Trebet, and Super Inframan. If you'd like to help support the show, you can do so at wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight, joining me is Wren and Tim Renner and Joshua Cutchin, and also Patrick Harpur, all the way from the UK. Finally having you on again, Patrick.
Thanks, Seriah. Been looking forward to it.
And you wrote the foreword to Tim and Josh's book.
No, I didn't.
No.
I wrote them a little brief, a very fulsome blurb.
Blurb, okay.
So much.
Let me try that again. And you wrote a blurb for Tim and Josh's book.
I did. Yes, I was pleased to do it. It's a great book.
Thank you. That means a lot. So thank you.
And I just received my copy today, so I haven't even looked at it.
Yeah, I received my copy today, and I have looked at it, but only briefly. It's looking good. I'm looking forward to reading it again in depth.
Nice. All right. Well, I'm going to let these guys ask you most of the questions because I've had you on, but these guys have been dying to talk to you. So I'm going to hand it over to you guys, and I'll just jump in here and there.
Well, I feel shy now because you guys are the experts on all things paranormal, whereas I'm a bit out of the loop. But I dare say we can struggle on between us.
Well, I would dare argue that's sort of the elegance of a lot of the things that that you have said in the past, at least, is that they do have sort of a timeless nature, and I'm not sure if I've seen anything that really tells me otherwise. That I don't think that even if you're not up to breast on the most fantastic or the newest things, that your ideas wouldn't have as equal weight as they did when you first published, because there is sort of a timelessness to a lot of those ideas.
Amen.
But I'm also not going to lead with the first question. So anybody else who wants to do that, feel free.
I'm just here to
Well, it's true. I do keep dipping my toe into the great, wonderful, wacky world of the paranormal, and especially UFOs and so on. And I have to say that yes, I mean I haven't read anything that's made me want to change my book in any way, only to expand it a bit, because I wrote it before the glorious days of the internet, so all my research had to be done, the hard way, slogging away in libraries, and even then I'm a very bad researcher, because, I hate taking notes and things like that, which you had to do in those days. You couldn't cut and paste, So it was a labor of love, and I don't know, I don't want to be immodest, but it certainly hasn't been superseded. But then again, there's a sense in which it can't be, because it posits a kind of reality which you can't argue with. I mean, you can argue with it, but you can't say finally that it's true or false.
And we should mention that the book is Daimonic Reality, and you published it in 1992. Is that right?
95.
95. Okay, and it was in the 90s somewhere.
Yeah, and it's still in print from the Pine Winds Press up in Seattle.
Nice.
Well, I would argue very strongly that that it's aged particularly well because of this increasing trend that we see towards the verification of the reality of things like side effects, which you're on the wrong side of science if you think that things aren't trending that way. It's becoming pretty apparent in a lot of these lab-controlled studies, even though I personally don't think that the paranormal, the supernatural, etc., thrive in labs at all. That is one aspect of reality that is really sort of showing to prove some degree of replicability in the lab setting. But also, it's a good time to be into Jung. I mean, the Red Book was just published about a decade ago, I suppose, and the sort of outing of all this. His ideas are much more popular, I think, than they've been in a long time, and I think that has only sort of made Daimonic Reality age like a fine cheese.
Yeah, it certainly stinks. Yeah. That's kind words. I think it's true, though. I mean, Jung doesn't age, and although he was one of my great mentors in writing that book, he's not my favorite. His collective unconscious isn't my favorite model for the kind of reality that allows for paranormal phenomena. My favorite models are probably, different. Like, for instance, the romantic imagination, which I'm very fond of, which is very like Jung's collective unconscious, but it's kind of a more poetic idea and less quasi-scientific. So I'd be all for the poetic, metaphorical approach to paranormal phenomena, and that's something you do in your book by willy-nilly, really, simply by noticing the connections between things, that one image leads to another image, and they're kind of all interconnected, but in the end sort of bottomless.
Well, it's almost like sometimes as if the universe free associates on its own, like a human being free associates. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And also Jung drew attention to the fact, I mean, I think one of the things that holds us up is the belief that the idea of psyche has been diminished to the idea of mind, but in its original meaning amongst the Greeks, psyche meant soul, and soul is not confined within us, but the soul is also in the world, as it were. So there isn't that terrible divide between us and the world, between subject and object, that we're all embedded in an ensouled cosmos, and the nature of that soul is fluid and shape-shifting and what I would call daimonic after the Greeks. That I really, in my book, I only wanted to draw attention to the fact that there was a perfectly good and intelligible tradition which took paranormal phenomena entirely into account. It wasn't anything extraordinary, really. It fitted with their general view of what reality was like, of an ensouled world which threw up these extraordinary images. Amongst those images are humans themselves. So there's no question of this model explaining paranormal phenomena in the way that we now demand, but I think it does make a kind of sense in the pre-logical sense of, in a poetic way. Does that make sense?
No, I mean, absolutely. I think one of the things that you helped me to really understand was the idea that, there are truths that are literally true, and there are things that are just as true or truer, which are metaphorically true. If memory does serve, and if I'm off base, please forgive me, but I seem to recall, an example that you might have supplied that was, you can see, something that happened in a film that might be like a love affair, and it might not have literally happened, but the things and the emotions that are represented in this fictional story, the way that you watch this relationship die, really might be the truest thing that you've ever seen. I don't know if I made up that you said that, but
I didn't say that, but I'll take it.
Yeah, well,
but of course that's what we go to art for. It's life writ large, that it never literally happened, but it's truer than life itself. Yeah, and that's a truism to say that.
Well, that bifurcation that people have a real hard time dealing with of the imaginal versus the imaginary, I think, is an idea that the paranormal community should probably get on board with sooner rather than later, because I think it has a certain degree of explicative power in a lot of these encounters.
It's certainly true, Josh. My follow-up to Daimonic Reality, the Philosopher's Secret Fire, I called it, outlines the whole imaginative tradition, and it's really one long sustained attack on this modern folly of literalism, of not believing anything is true or real unless it's literally true or real, whereas I think the opposite is the case. You know, I think that the true stories of our souls are myths, and the word myth, as we know, has come to mean something untrue. But I think they are, you know, the true stories that tell us more about the human condition than any modern myths of neuroscience or whatever can possibly do.
Well, and I think, again, that's part of the staying power of Daimonic Reality, is that it sort of is, in a lot of ways, an antidote to this mind virus that's crept into Fortiana of things having to be lopped into this dualistic idea, you know, not only imaginary versus imaginal, but also physical versus non-physical. I mean, you know, it's amazing to me that we can have this discipline that talks about, you know, spirits and ghosts that slam doors and leave footprints, but the moment that you try to suggest any of these other things, like, you know, the little people, UFOs, and again, because it's been on my mind, Bigfoot, the moment that you say, well, they might be physical and non-physical, or non-physical and can have physical impacts on the world, they scoff at you. And I think that there was a time when that, I don't get why that has become such a lockdown sort of stance in terms of people who are into these topics, other than the fact that they've just gotten swept up in this materialist, physicalist, reductionist paradigm that the rest of, you know, Western civilization has.
Yes, I quite agree.
What was that?
Sorry, I was just going to say, like, yeah, that's like the curse of Descartes, right? Like this idea that things either have to be of the mind or of the body, and there is no middle ground. And I think there's a larger conversation there about why that particular view of the world and reality became almost necessary for modern society, even though it only seems to increase alienation in people rather than give people a sense of transcendent meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. And but the kind of materialist worldview is only a very recent phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Didn't really come into full force till the 19th century, and it was preceded by sort of Enlightenment rationalism. And together, rationalism and materialism have, you know, teamed up to form a terrible ideology, really, which rules out all the things we're interested in, and you know, just asserts wildly that they're impossible. But before then, and even now, you know, there's a whole raft of people who've experienced the world quite otherwise, and so on. You know, one of the troubles with paranormal events, and, you know, just things like UFOs or Bigfoot, is that they run the whole gamut from the sublime to the ridiculous. You know, there's something trivial about them, or something unimportant about them. The world wouldn't be very different if they weren't there. But at the same time, you have to take them into account, and once you do that, they become incredibly important, because they seem to subvert the very ideologies that banish them, and so on. And the other thing they do is to, if you follow them faithfully, as your book does, Tim and Josh, in all the ramifications, they lead you to a completely different worldview, a whole philosophy of life, in fact, you know, and a whole different view of reality. So, in one sense, they're unimportant, but as C.S. Lewis said, their unimportance may well be their importance. But once again, there's a kind of everything they do is paradoxical, including even their meaning is paradoxical. Even the fact that, not just the fact that they could be both material and immaterial, but the fact that they could be both sublime and absurd at the same time, you know, almost comical. I mean, quite a lot of paranormal phenomena are just witty.
Yeah, and we're sort of, you know, getting into coincidentia positorum sort of territory here as well.
Yes, we are. Would you like to explain that, Josh?
I'm not the one who's written a book on alchemy, Patrick. I mean, basically it is this union of opposites, and I think it takes very little, in terms of, you know, it's basically the idea of this sort of sublime combination of two things that seem diametrically opposed. And that's part of the reason that I think, I mean, you could easily view Bigfoot as a manifestation of that. But, a lot of other things like, I mean, it doesn't take much imagination to view things like, spirits is the same way, neither living nor dead. Bigfoot neither being, a human nor an animal. UFOs sort of occupying this. I mean, this ties in a lot with ideas of liminality, and I've been trying to distance myself from ideas of liminality for a little while now, but simply because I feel like it's really easy to get liminality pareidolia, where you just see liminality everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I just think people have to come to grips with the fact that this is something that things like Bigfoot help us to do, which is that at the heart of things is paradox. There are just things we can't think, and it drives us mad because we want to think everything through, and we want to believe that thought has some sort of logical conclusion. But a paradox is by definition something you can't think. You have to have some kind of other attitude towards it. It's a bit like believing in the incarnation of Christ, who was both God and man. You can't think that. You have to confront it with something else. Well, in the Christian tradition, you confront it with faith. How you confront Bigfoot, whether you confront that with faith or not, I don't know. But paradox is the key to it, really. And when you get things like you just mentioned hybrids, lovely. The idea of hybrids is a lovely metaphor, isn't it, for the in-betweenness of it's a kind of literalization of the in-betweenness of daimonic events.
Yeah, I think it was John Mack who referred to them as like a reification of that particular metaphor, sort of made flesh.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, how much of philosophy is really based on this sort of this absurdity, angle. I mean, when you say that, I think about, Kierkegaard, and the way that, he sort of based his belief around a lot of absurdity as well. But in terms of the materialist paradigm, you just don't get a lot of room for that, because there's this replicability, or I would even say control fetish, that we have to really push against. It's I think it was I don't know if you've had any interactions with Gordon White, who's a Australian chaos magician and author, but he has always spoken very highly of your work, and he once said that you don't measure tides in your sink, and you don't measure the performance of a football player on a treadmill. So why should we hold these other very, very exceedingly rare events and paranormal occurrences to the same standard that we would something as mundane and reliable as gravity, or the way that certain chemical reactions behave? It really is a fool's errand.
Yeah, I quite agree. I think that I just don't like the way that modernity has kind of tried to do away with the wonderful. That was it Plato who said that philosophy begins with wonder, and I take that to be double-edged, really. Wonder in the sense of being awesome, and wonder in the sense of wondering about, speculating. And I don't like the way that people try and cut that out. Fortunately, the common man like me meets people all the time who've seen the most wonderful things, both natural wonders and supernatural wonders, and so it goes on. So I think we should take more notice of wonderful things.
Well, I think this is something that, and this is sort of a tee up for both Wren and Tim, because I'm tired of talking for a minute. But I can take this in two directions. The first one of which I know Wren has been rather passionate about is I think that a lot of the reason that we see so much discord in our world today has a lot to do with disenchantment, and it's a big persistent problem, I would say, of the left the world over, but in particular the American left, to reject spiritualism and to really sort of buy all in on this reductivist model of a lot of things. And, on the right in America, you have this strong Christian influence, which kind of takes it on the right side of politics to the other opposite extreme. But I think, Wren, and if you feel differently, please call me out on this. But I think that it's a major shortfalling of a lot of movements on the left in America to sort of reject this enchanted worldview wholesale. And similarly, to cue up Tim, and you guys can take this in any order you want to, I know that Tim likes to push back on the idea that the world is disenchanted at all. I think Tim would probably argue that the world has never been disenchanted and will never be disenchanted. It's we who have become disenchanted. So discuss.
Well, you said my point for me there, Josh.
Wren, did I mischaracterize your views at all, or?
Not quite. I would push back a little bit and say that that's not entirely true of the global left. Maybe the left in America, but there is a strong tradition of the Catholic left. A leftism in which, Catholicism plays a major part, and it's a pretty popular thing in the global South. However, I understand what you're saying. I think that is largely in part, like if we're talking about Marxist views, that Marx makes the point, and this is true, that in order to understand class, you need to understand the material conditions that lead to that. And so there is this focus on material conditions, but it's different from what we're talking about when we talk about materialism, right? It is a material analysis. In reality, well, I think what happens a lot within leftist discourse is that they tend to focus exclusively on the material conditions to the detriment of any sort of spiritual thought or philosophy. And now this manifests quite strongly in the Soviet Union and the state-sponsored atheism. But I've also heard prominent leftist voices in America call for a more spiritual path for the left. You still need the material analysis because that's important. But like what I mentioned earlier when I was talking about alienation, the thing that the left does lack is a sense of personal transcendence or spiritual growth. And that is an important thing for human beings. I think that's an integral part of being human is having that spiritual experience and having spiritual growth as a person and the promise of transcendence. And I think a lot of social ills, and that affects everybody in the modern industrialized world, right? Spirituality has been reduced to mostly a material thing. I mean, you mentioned, a lot of people on the let's say right in America are Christian, but most of them have never had a transcendent ecstatic experience while at church. A lot of churches, social hours, people meeting with their neighbors and not necessarily having a spiritual experience.
It's almost like its own form of disenchanted religion. Exactly. But I think that is a valid criticism of the left, and it is something that they've got to work on. Humans desire transcendence, and if you eliminate that possibility, all it does is further alienate people and create lives without meaning.
Yeah, I'd say as a modern American, at least, you have to choose a life of symbol and meaning, and if you don't, it's still going to come. People who don't believe in anything still see UFOs. They still see ghosts. It creeps up, and that's why I say it's not so much that the world's been disenchanted. It's still there, and it's always going to come out. But if you choose to live a life of symbol and to recognize these symbols, I feel like it's a fuller life. At least it has been for me. The synchronicity is far more interesting than coincidence.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to what I feel like a large part of Daimonic Reality is talking about. That, and I've said this before, it doesn't matter if you don't believe in demons or spirits or magic. You don't need to believe in it to see it or to see its effects, because it has an external, non-subjective reality to it. that is undeniable to people who've experienced it.
Okay. Any thoughts, Patrick?
Very big topic, this one. I don't feel I'm qualified to, pontificate on the state of politics and religion in the United States. I would say that what I'd be suspicious of is the degree to which ideologies have swept the Western world, and the feature of ideologies is that they're sort of quasi-religions, but they're very simplistic ones, that they usually have one simple idea at the center of them, which is overwhelming, and people like it for that reason. Because they like it because it's simple and it can be reduced to slogans. And I would like to dissolve ideologies back into religion, but by that I don't necessarily mean, denominational religions. For instance, fundamentalist Christianity, while it has many, many wonderful people in it, is not for me because it's too literalistic. It's sort of like the equal and opposite of the scientistic worldview, that by taking every word in the Bible literally, it tends to stifle kind of true religious experience, I think. But America has given us the idea of being able to be religious without being a member of any denomination, particularly, what you might loosely call spirituality, in which all kinds of cross-cultural religions are studied, in which mysticism is central. And I think that would be, the way to go. And I don't really mean that necessarily in a very New Agey kind of way, although the New Age seems fairly harmless to me. I'm an old age man myself. I've gone back to the beginning, to the origins of religion in the great myths of the Greeks and the Hindus and so on. The second thing I'd say is that what really bothers me perhaps is the way in which Western societies have abandoned young people when it comes to religion, either bringing them up in very stifling and dogmatic religions, or abandoning them to materialism and atheism altogether. And what's needed, I think, he said, I don't know why I'm saying this, since I don't know what I'm talking about, but what I do think is lacking is the idea of initiation. Because there is no society that doesn't have initiation rites. And that's something that young people need, that they need to be initiated into adulthood and into the full membership of society. And if they don't get it, being sensible and imaginative humans, they try and initiate themselves. They themselves court danger and hardship and form gangs, and they don't actually circumcise themselves like tribes do, but they tattoo themselves and pierce themselves, and they do all the things that initiation rites prescribe, but they do it on a informal basis, and they don't know how to get beyond that liminal stage to be reintegrated into society as full citizens. I think I've gone off the point here, rather, but it just struck me while you were talking that might or might not be relevant. It's certainly relevant to the idea of enchantment, I think. I think they're disenchanted because they can't make that leap from childhood to adulthood via sacred rituals which introduce them into a great, broad, more religious and cosmic view of the world.
Well, it's also, I was just going to say, it's almost like disenchantment is its own sort of rite of passage for the West now, in terms of like, oh, you used to believe that when you were a kid. Don't believe that anymore. Now you're an adult. Sorry, Seriah. Go ahead.
I see what you mean. Yes.
I was just going to say, Patrick, you talk a lot about that in your book, The Secret Tradition of the Soul, which isn't as well known as Daimonic Reality, but it's an excellent book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, yes, it's true. Yeah, I mean, it's not as well known. Yeah, but
I think you make a good point there. Like that lack of initiation is a real problem. I think, especially with young men in America. Like, you still have some initiatory structures, like in Christian churches in America. You still have like sort of the initiation of baptism, but that's typically done to children, or even in this, like in Catholic churches, to literal babies. And it's like, how are they supposed to have an initiatory experience when they're not like at that stage where they can integrate any of it? Like myself personally, I was lucky enough that I was in like the Boy Scouts of America, and they have a whole secret mystery school society called the Order of the Arrow that has a whole initiation, which involves like a trial, like a day of silence and labor, fasting, spending a night out in the woods by yourself, and performing all of these sort of rituals. And that was like a powerful initiatory experience for me when I was young. But I feel like most people never have anything like that, and they resort to like what you were talking about, Patrick, with these informal initiatory structures that don't allow for any synthesis.
Yes, I am. But you're quite right. The Boy Scouts was kind of modelled on the idea of the wolf packs and all that. And I think young people would love to be kidnapped and taken out to the woods and buried in shallow graves and starved and told to meditate and recite prayers, and then be brought back to a great blazing bonfire and everybody dancing and music and fantastic. I mean, that would be a great experience. And I think kids, they don't like being safe. That's the great mantra in England anyway. Oh, we must keep all the little kids safe. Bollocks to that. Sorry, Seriah, but
bollocks is fine.
I think they're gagging for a fight. They're looking to find out if they can take it, if they are men, and if they are women. There's a terrible fear, especially amongst young women, that they're not seen. That they're kind of invisible. That's why they all want to be rock stars and be on television, because they want to be visible. But that's kind of the wrong way round. They want to know who they are in themselves, is what they want to know. And to not provide kids with that is terrible. I think we're letting them down very badly. So we should, if we can't revive old, the church initiation rites, of course, exist, but they're a faint echo, really. They've been they're pretty toothless. That we should have much more stringent ones. I don't know about scarring and circumcision, which takes place in tribes in Africa, but something a bit like that, a bit of pain anyway, would be a good thing, because then people feel good about themselves. They feel they can take it. They're tough. They're themselves.
Well,
there needs to be like Ordeal. Like Ordeal is the important
Ordeals,
part.
yes, exactly,
But I don't think that, necessarily the ordeal was so much the point in a lot of these cultures as it was finding a way around the ego by merit of pain that almost gives you this sort of out-of-body experience.
Yeah, that may be so. I mean, certainly. I don't know how severe the pain has to be. Really, it has to be pretty severe to put you outside yourself like that. But certainly, it is to do with all initiation is about death and rebirth.
Right.
So you're dying away from one state and being reborn in another state, whether it's child to adult or adult to married person or living person to dead person. Those are the great stages of initiation.
Right.
Yeah, certainly. Death and rebirth is the key to it all. Yeah, certainly.
Does the alien abduction experience fill that role for people?
Well, I tried to make a case for that in for lack of any other explanation. And it's certainly true that some alien abduction experiences either resemble initiations or have the effect of initiations. You know, people's lives are changed and they're kind of reborn into a different way of perceiving the world. You know, so I think that case could be made, but I wouldn't be dogmatic about it because, you know, having studied alien abductions at great length, it's impossible to say with any certainty what they're all about. You know.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and then once again, that's absurdity often comes into the abduction experience as well.
Yes, exactly. You know, they're also different, or the same. You know, they're similar, but they all contain sort of telling differences. I just think that I'm happy with alien abductions being genuine mysteries. You know, that we don't have to explain or solve. You know, I'm happy with the idea that people are from time to time snatched into the other world, whether by aliens or fairies or big feet or whatever. You know, and that's part of the human experience. But I would say that's something that we can do ourselves. You know, that poets and shamans and visionaries, they go into the other world. The only difference is they do it voluntarily. And we can all do it voluntarily if we practice a bit. But we have to find our own way of getting there, you know, whether through fasting or praying or whether through taking drugs or whatever.
Mm-hmm. On that topic, one thing that, since I just, you know, reread Daimonic Reality, first of all, I love that in 1995 it was published.
92, right?
No, 95.
95, yeah. I love that in 95 you were telling people to read Iamblichus, because I was on this very show just a couple of weeks ago complaining that ufologists don't read Iamblichus. So I'd forgotten that you even wrote that in there. It came like my reading the mysteries by Iamblichus came about because of my own research into magic and the Solomonic method. And that's one thing I noticed in Daimonic Reality was that you talk about Bruno, you talk about Neoplatonism, so you obviously have some familiarity with this sort of alchemical magical tradition, but one thing I noticed was conspicuously absent was any mention of spirit conjuration or, you know, the Solomonic method or Goetia or anything like that. And I was wondering, was it just because you weren't familiar with it, or was there some reason that you left that out? Because it seems to me like it's a way of engaging with the spirit world on our own terms rather than waiting for it to come to you.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I left it out is I don't know anything about it. And the reason I don't know anything about it is it's not to my taste. You know, it's just purely a temperamental thing. And I just can't work up much interest in ritual magic. I mean, I say that, but I do quite like Renaissance magic, you know, as was founded by the likes of Marsilio Ficino in Florence, where they manipulated the imagination, really, either to initiate themselves into vision or else to bring about changes in others, almost a kind of therapy, really. And they seem to work with, they called it imagination, actually, and they did that through magical means, i.e. by sigils and symbols and music and smells, you know, sensory experience. They would immerse people in this, and that would call forth. But that seems to me, I mean, they called that natural magic, and I can kind of see the point of that. It's sort of like sympathetic magic, which I rather like, but kind of more severe, Crowley-esque magic, conjuring, you know, demons from the ninth sphere and things like that. I don't know, I always feel that's a little bit more about getting power. And in the end, you know, the power starts to wane. So you have to kind of fake the power a bit with sex magic, you know, charge it up a bit, and then that doesn't work so well after a bit because power always runs out. So then you amplify it with drugs and so on, you know. I think it just, you know, I'm sure it's probably not like that, although Crowley didn't end up too well in the end. But he ended up sort of broke and sad in a boarding house in the south coast of England, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't do it much good in the long run. But anyway, that's sort of my feeling about it. But I mean, I'm sure I'm not representing magic properly, or you know. But when I look at traditional magic, there's the kind of magic I like, Renaissance magic, and the kind of magic that I feel I'm just not drawn to it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, like the core of my own practice is based around like sort of Renaissance magic. So like Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy and the works of Trithemius of Spanheim.
Yes, they're the great classic works. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of my work is based around that. And I originally got interested in it because I was just solely interested in ufology. And I was reading Passport to Magonia and was reading about the story of Fascius Cardan and him summoning the sylphs, you know, who act and talk very much like blonde-haired UFO contactee space brother types. And I thought to myself,
yes.
Oh, maybe all of this like spirit conjuration magic that I read about in these books, maybe the things that are being called are the same things that are appearing to people in these UFO experiences. And rather me waiting to have some sort of UFO experience to learn the truth about it, maybe I can study these old books and learn how to initiate myself into these experiences. Because for me, it was less about, like, I don't really care about summoning a demon to help me find buried treasure or anything. Like, for me, I just want the knowledge. I want to have that sort of transcendent experience of a non-human entity appearing, you know?
Well, have you conjured spirits? Have you conjured sylphs and nature spirits?
I have. Well, specifically, a lot of the stuff I work with is like sort of the John D. Angel magic kind of stuff. And
you speak fluent Enochian, do you?
No, I still have to write it all out. But like the main practice I've been working with is the Trithemian drawing spirits into crystals method from Francis Spirits, the Magus. And a lot of the spirits I've been working with are these like angelic entities. And while I can't say that I've had one just appear in my living room or anything, I have seen physical effects like manifest that I've asked for. Like a lot of the work I've been doing with the Archangel Raphael and involving wind, I needed to conjure a storm to do something. And so I did this whole conjuration of Raphael and asked him to carry this out. And like within minutes, the people who were where I needed to conjure the storm at were talking about how the winds were going crazy. And then one of their wives ran off the road by the wind. So I felt a little bad about it afterwards. I was like, well I didn't need that much, a little too much there.
Good, but you want to watch it, yeah. Well, that's very interesting, Ren.
So, there was, when we were going back to the idea of abductions and stuff, when I look at one of the things I've been talking about is how the abduction experience, the near-death experience, these things almost come across as shamanic experiences, and possibly part of the reason they happen to us is because there's such an absence of that in our world today.
Yeah, it's quite true. And it may be that people who have those experiences have the shamanic calling, but they just don't know it because it's kind of not recognized. I don't know, but it's quite plausible, I think.
Yeah, no, Mike Cleland has made that exact point, Seriah, that he thinks that it is...
So Mike Cleland, do you say?
Yeah, Mike Cleland, yeah.
Yeah.
That I think I've heard him say, and I may be misquoting him here, but I'm just paraphrasing, that due to the lack of initiatory structures and the lack of shamans in modern Western society, like the spirits still need, because the job of the shaman to sort of mediate between the human world and the spirit world, that need still exists even if we don't have shamans anymore. And so these initiatory, quote unquote abduction experiences are happening because it's the spirit world trying to build more shamans in order to mediate. I think that's a fascinating idea.
A shaman
quota,
yeah.
Yeah, it's a good idea, isn't it? Yeah, I like it. But of course we don't have a formal shamanic culture anymore. But God knows there are enough people who set themselves up as communicating with the other world, aren't there? There's mediums and prophets and gurus and self-help people, and the kind of world's also seething with people who claim to be able to bring back something from the beyond to benefit mankind, which is the primary shamanic purpose. So it kind of goes on in a sort of chaotic and informal way, I guess.
True.
Don't you think?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's why I think, like that may not be the same type of thing as what is needed for some people. And that's why we have, I was boggled the first time I read Kenneth Ring's book, where he's showing the similarities of the after effects of a near-death experience and the after effects of an alien abduction experience. And I was like, how does this make any sense? How are these two things connected? And of course, now we know people who have alien abduction experiences, which are probably not aliens in the first place, but they're also seeing people who have passed away. So there's some connection there. There's some otherworld sort of thing going on. As you said, you don't feel the need to explain it. And I don't know that we can explain it. I think it's something that's sort of in between a lot of different stuff. And it just takes a form depending on how we enter into it.
I mean, I would certainly argue, as I sort of did a little bit last night when I was talking with Tim, that the point is kind of not to explain it. Like, I think the point is to reach this Gnostic, position where you decide that you're not going to have the answers by the end of your lifetime, some sort of concrete answer as to what lies behind these phenomena, but rather to have your own sense of, the UFO community is constantly crowing on about disclosure as if it's going to be handed down from on high by the government. And it's not what real disclosure is. Real disclosure happens with you reconciling this worldview with your experiences, I think.
Yeah. But still, you can't just go, and I've talked about this before, pushing back on some of Greg Bishop's ideas. You can't constantly also not provide any form to the experiences, because I think that's part of the point. Like, it can't be observed in its totality, because it's similar to a Platonic ideal, right? You have this ideal shape, but that ideal shape can't be observed or interacted with. It has to be given a form by filtering down into the material world. By giving it a form, it allows you to interact with it. But without giving it that form, there's nothing to interact with.
That's true. Agnosticism can be sort of a crutch, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean you have to wholly believe in any one thing, right? Like, you can change how you believe in it. You can believe whatever you want about it, but it has to be given some kind of form. Because without that, there's no link between it and you.
Right. Mm. It needs a camouflaged reality in between.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that, Patrick?
I was just thinking, I don't know. I suppose you could compare it to the need for initiation, that it's possible to devise rituals. But I can't really see us devising a sort of society-wide consensus ritual for our shamans, as it were, as tribal societies do. There'd be just too much debate and splinter groups, It'd be very difficult to get us kind of uniform, to reinstate a kind of uniformly acceptable form of shamanism, don't you think? I think we can't go back, but I don't know what the answer is. I do know more religion's needed, but in the biggest sense possible,
Mm-hmm.
And maybe people can carve out their own rituals. Maybe you could have the meditation groups and the prayer shamans and the meditation shamans and the ayahuasca shamans. Maybe we should have a lot of different shamanic groups, and people could join the one that suits their personality.
Tribes.
But certainly we need more contact with the other world, But I personally think there's no substitute for, sitting in a darkened room attempting to write poetry. Because sooner or later that poem starts to write you, and you realize that, there's something much bigger. But that's not a popular view, because it's hard work.
Well, no, I mean, but it's that idea of, people not having ideas, but rather ideas having people, which, it's very, very resonant with the subject.
Yeah, sure. I don't think I've had an idea in my life. They just come into my head. I mean, it's not like I had it. It
Right.
just came to me. Or else you read something and you know it's true. Where does that come from? Well, Plato told us where it comes from. It's remembering what we knew before we were born. And I accept that as good an explanation as any, really.
One of my favorite musicians, Robin Williamson, has a quote, which I will butcher here, but it's something along the lines of the music comes from above or from somewhere else, and I just try not to get in the way too much, which I absolutely love that quote.
Is that Robin Williamson of the Incredible String Band?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Very fond of them.
Me as well. One of my favorites.
Yeah, well, music's almost in a category of its own, in that it does seem to be supernatural, that the music seemed to pour through Mozart, in a quite inexplicable way. Not just in quality, but in quantity. The amount that he wrote that just poured through him, because he died in his 30s, didn't he? I mean, it was quite extraordinary. So, and also music is one of only two areas where you can be a prodigy. That's to say, you could be a very young child and show extraordinary musical talent out of the blue with virtually no training. The other area being mathematics, and that's why they're connected. But it's very hard to think of a prodigy novelist, But, a child of 3 can't really write a novel. You need a lot of life experience for that. But you can somehow magically with music and mathematics. They seem to be otherworldly things that can be sort of transmitted directly. It's very difficult to understand that. At least I can't think of any other kind of gifts other than music and mathematics, which you see in prodigies and savants of a very young age.
Do you personally, what do you think of the idea of reincarnation?
Me?
Yeah.
My personal jury is still out on that one. I don't like it much, but I think that could be my Christian upbringing. I think that everything that you do in this world should be decisive somehow, but that could be just sort of a kind of residual Puritanism on my part, because I can't ignore the fact that more cultures believe in reincarnation than don't. And I'm a great respecter of, global cultures. So the answer is, I tackle it slightly in my book on the soul, and I tend to take the view that Yeats takes, and it's quite a complicated view, which is that maybe he takes the view that that we all exist in the great anima mundi, in the great collective imagination, and that some part of ourselves could perhaps be reincarnated in order to complete the whole. But I can't quite rehearse his arguments here because they're rather complex. But I remember thinking, yeah, if I were to believe in reincarnation, it would be something like that. So I've read books on reincarnation. I've read the evidence for reincarnation, and it's both convincing and unconvincing at the same time, like all these things, So when I'm reading it, I'm always completely convinced. But once again, what I don't like about reincarnation is its literalism, that it's a kind of substitute for eternity. Mm-hmm. That instead of passing into some eternal state, you just pass into another life on and on and on, thousands and thousands of times, until you're freed from the bonds of Maya and you pass into the great void that is nirvana, for example. The Greeks had a very sophisticated notion of reincarnation called metempsychosis, which meant, that souls could travel into other people and indeed into animals. I don't particularly like that idea. You better get someone else who knows more about it to talk. I don't know why I'm waffling on. I have no idea what I'm talking about.
Well, let's change the subject up a little bit, because I've been wanting to ask you about this for a while. I had sent you some of the stuff with the Missing 411 interviews I did, and you connected it to some of the disappearances you were aware of in Fae culture and stuff like that. After listening to those national park disappearances and stuff, what do you make of them?
Oh, God. Yeah, I find them very disturbing, don't we all? Once again, there's no explanation for them. You could say that it's like living folklore, isn't it? The abduction, especially of children, which is doubly disturbing somehow, as if they had been carried off by the equivalent of the Irish fairies or the European elves, And you could, for elves and fairies, you could read Bigfoot, which are like big fairies, if you'll pardon the expression. And the answer is I don't know. I have no idea what's going on there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
sorry to have I have no insight into it really. I kind of read it and I puzzle over it.
As I've said very often, I think that the whole Missing 411 phenomena is very much a paranormal Rorschach test, where whatever your key theory is, that's what you're most likely to see. And obviously, someone who's very sympathetic to a lot of these, little folk fairy traditions out of Western Europe, I see a lot of the fairy tradition in there, and I would argue that it's probably the most explicable, but even has the most explicable power, I should say. But even after that's been, even after you go down that path, I still don't think that those fairy traditions really explain what's beyond those phenomena. Just like I don't think that our modern extraterrestrial mythology explains what lies behind the UFO phenomena either. I think
they're definitely not explanations. They're images of things that have always been held to be true, that somehow or other the other world is prone to abducting humans. Whether the gods take you, or whether it's the daimons, or whether it's the fairies. That seems to be an enduring mythology. And
they're consistent bodies of belief surrounding how these other intelligences interact with humanity. But as far as the objective reality of what these other intelligences are, that's still very much up for debate, at least in my eyes.
Well, indeed, yeah, absolutely. But then, whatever's denizens there are in the other world, they're notorious shape changers. So they could be the same thing shape changing, or they could be separate things we don't know. The whole other world is a shape shifting realm. The one thing that bothers me slightly about the 411 phenomena is that nobody comes back. I think occasionally they're found, aren't they? But in fairy lore, abductees come back.
Right.
And often they come back not in a good state, very disoriented and a bit touched in the head.
And that is how people who come back
after 7 years and they're okay again. Sorry?
But the people who do come back are usually found kind of dazed and wandering. So, that kind of fits.
Yeah, that's
in the Missing 411 literature.
Yeah.
Aside from children, though, do you guys remember that story that I think it was from last year, where that little boy went missing? In very, very cold temperatures. It was the conditions should have killed him, but he was found a couple days later, and he said that he was that a mother bear came and took care of him and kept him warm.
I don't even think he said mother bear. I think he just said a bear.
He just said bear, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, a bear came and took care of him and kept him warm, and that's how he survived. And there was all kinds of explanations, like he just imagined it, or it was like because his favorite show is a show about a cartoon bear, so they thought that was just in his head or something.
Right.
But people like us, we look at that and we're like, I don't know, maybe he's telling the truth. A bear really did come.
Yeah. There's a huge mythology about humans being looked after by wild animals, lions and bears and wolves and God knows what else, yeah. So maybe sometimes it actually happens, who knows?
Or it may not have been a real physical bear, but
Exactly.
a bear still took care of him.
Absolutely, yeah. It could have just seemed like a bear to him. Could have been a guardian angel, for all we know. Yeah.
So
or his higher self. I mean, there's plenty of stuff. I know that Claude Lécouteau talks about how, especially in Scandinavian countries, there was this concept that the soul was divided into two parts, like a humanistic part and an animalistic part. So maybe for all we know, it was either his higher or lower self that was taking the guise of a bear as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Or as I would call it, the personal daimon. One of the incentives for me to write my book on the soul was because I hadn't dealt previously with the idea at any length with the idea of the personal daimon, and that's like a guardian angel. And it was an idea that was sort of forced on me by the material. Really, the more anthropology I read, the more I realized how widespread the idea was that we are born with a kind of a heavenly counterpart or companion, a guardian angel, or as the Greeks called it, a daimon, a personal daimon, just as Socrates famously had, which guides and protects us throughout life, which, as it were, holds the blueprint of our lives, according to which we have to build our souls. We have to build our lives according to this blueprint. And I kind of resisted this at the beginning because it suggests a kind of an element of predestination. But there's a lot of wriggle room inside the idea of the personal daimon, but and of course we're free to deny its dictates, the plans it has for us. But it was rather an appealing idea and very, very widespread. And so in tribal cultures, it's often identified with an ancestor or something after whom the child is named, and that becomes their personal daimon and so on. And psychologically, it interested me because, I suddenly thought the idea that we're impelled by the past, by our good or bad parents or childhood traumas or whatever, is kind of turned on its head, that maybe we're compelled by the future, by this kind of blueprint that already adumbrates our future selves, and we're drawn or magnetized towards fulfilling that plan, realizing ourselves in accordance with it. And I thought that was rather an appealing idea, and something that Kierkegaard also hinted at, which was doubly interesting for me.
Yeah, a lot of, to kind of link that in with what we were talking about earlier, a lot of those cultures also have some sort of initiatory experience that establishes contact between yourself and your personal daemon. Like in Lukumi, you have this whole initiation where you're given a head spirit. Like the spirit literally lives in your head. Or like in sort of Western ritual magic, you have the Abramelin ritual, which is like this, 16-month prayers and fasting and all of these operations in order to make contact with your holy guardian angel, So I think it's interesting that, like without that initiatory structure, without people having that, like most people wouldn't even be able to reach or know their personal daemon on any level.
Yes, well, I think it may be true that you need that kind of initiation to become aware of it. Most people but I think we all have one, or at least according to Plato, we all have one, and who am I to contradict Plato? But I think that certain people have been initiated, or exceptional people become kind of hyper-aware of their personal daimon in the way that Jung was. He talks about his daimon driving him ruthlessly to fulfill his life task, even at the cost of personal happiness. And W.B. Yeats, my other great favorite poet stroke shaman, talks in exactly the same way, that the daimon doesn't save you from suffering because it may contradict entirely what you think you want for yourself. It may deny you all sorts of things, earthly love, for instance, but it ruthlessly conducts you towards a life of fulfillment and meaning. And so, in the end, you have to go with it if you can.
Yeah, I think that's what I think Yates and other people probably explained it a little more eloquently, but I think that is what Crowley was trying to get at with his idea of true will. This idea that you do have some sort of purpose or blueprint, and that not consciously not following that blueprint leads to misery, but that trying to not only determine what that blueprint is, but then follow that blueprint leads to fulfillment and transcendence.
Did Crowley say that?
Yeah, that's the whole Crowleyan idea of true will.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, it's the most sensible thing I've heard from him. Yeah. I'll definitely buy into that. Yeah.
So, you also have a couple. You released a fiction book a few years back.
Yes, or novel, as we call it.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. No. After Daimonic Reality, after some time had passed, I felt I still had unfinished business with UFOs and abductions and things like that, and I wanted to attack it again, but I didn't want to do it from the outside, as it were, as a research project. I wanted to get inside it. So I wrote a novel called The Good People, which is freely available in the United States of America from the MIT Press. Little puff there for me, which was about, essentially three women who see an extraordinary object in the sky at dawn in London in the late 1980s, and what happens to them. And, their paths, as a result of having this revelatory experience, are become very different. One joins a cult, for instance. One starts to remember missing time and delves into it, and much to her horror, because she's married to an elderly vicar, Church of England vicar. And so I'm able to draw in all sorts of different kind of threads and to reimagine the abduction experience for myself, from the inside, as it were. So that was why I felt compelled to write that book, which is called The Good People, which of course is kind of a pun because they're all good people, but it's also a reference to the fairies, who are called the good people, more in hope than expectation.
Okay.
So that's a little plug for that novel. I hope everybody will go and read it, because I think it says more about. For me, it's a more truthful account of the UFO experience than Daimonic Reality, simply because I've engaged with it in a more personal and imaginative way. Mm-hmm. In other words, fiction is often stranger than and truer than fact.
Yes.
More effective and more elegant at speaking truths a lot of times, yeah.
Hopefully, anyway, yeah. So thanks for letting me get that in there, Seriah.
Oh, absolutely. And what's your latest book about?
I haven't written anything since the Kierkegaard book, which was 2 years ago.
And what is that one?
Well, it's just a novel based on the life and work of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. It's almost a kind of antidote to Daimonic Reality because, he was a kind of he was a Christian, and he believed very much in two worlds, but he said you've got to choose either this world or the other world, whereas Daimonic Reality is all about, we live in a both-and world, that the daimons are both of this world and of another world. So it's in my soul book I describe the distinction between spirit and soul, and the Kierkegaard book is a spiritual book, whereas Daimonic Reality is a soul book. I have to say that I come down on the side of soul in the end, but that's yeah. It's more like it's like saying, if I were to ask what I believed, I would say that I was theologically a Christian monotheist, but psychologically a Greek polytheist, In other words, I'm that impossible thing, a Christian polytheist, which is what William Blake was, which gave me encouragement, because I thought, well, it's possible to be those two things, to believe both in the one and the many, as the ancient philosophers put it, and not be driven towards, a holy spiritual, one God kind of attitude of aspiration, climbing mountains and being terribly spiritual, or on the other hand, being trapped in the miasmic maze and labyrinths of psychopathology of the soul.
People have often asked me, Tim, what are you? What do you believe? And I give this answer that, I guess just jives with exactly what you said. I always say I'm a Marian animist. I'm a Catholic Marian animist. That's the best I can explain.
Yes, that would do very well. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I might change to that. It sounds nicer. Yeah, I like it. Very, very good.
One of the things that, again, Kenneth Ring found was that people who had these weird experiences, whether they be near-death experiences or abduction experiences, they came back more spiritual but less dogmatically religious.
Yeah. Kind of what you would expect, isn't it?
Yeah, and I always found that interesting.
Very interesting. I haven't read that particular book of Rings. Did he find a lot of evidence of aliens, so-called aliens, appearing in near-death experiences?
I don't think so. Most of what he's looking at are the after effects.
You can find some things in some of the more out there literature that are psychopomps that look like aliens, but you don't normally see that as much. Look like alien greys. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, my understanding of the near-death experience literature, which I read a bit of, is that it's almost always beneficial. That there are some bad trips.
Right.
But they're nearly always good, and people do come back transformed because they've been flooded with either with a sense of fantastic knowledge or a sense of fantastic love, or anyway, some incredible, supernatural reality which has flooded them, and of course they're changed. But is that true of abduction experiences? I think a lot of people are just traumatized and left fragmented and unhappy.
I think with the abduction experiences, they're frightening to us because we don't understand them. And shamanic experiences also tend to be frightening. It takes some time. People who sit with the abduction experience, like Whitley Strieber and such, seem to come around to the idea that this is a transformative experience. So it may be just what that particular person needs at any given time.
I mean, I kind of fall down on the side that, I try to avoid these sort of statements as something being evil or negative, because those sort of absolutist statements don't really apply here. But I do think it is important, Mike Clellan has brought up the connection between owls and sort of the abduction experience. And it's important to look at, owls were seen as a symbol of wisdom in some parts of the world, but in other parts of the world, they were seen as malefic, like sort of creatures of the night.
Death omens, too, yeah.
Yeah, and especially with the case of the Lilin in sort of Semitic mythology, they were seen as, the child of Lilith, and they're even translated in the Bible as screech owl. And you have the Strigoi of sort of Eastern Europe that are described as these, or the Strix, I think, of Hellenistic Greece, but they're these bird demons who live in the night and waylay travelers and drink their blood. And that sort of evolves into the vampire myth later on. But there's still that connection with owls. And so I see it's hard for me not to look at the alien abduction phenomena and wonder if these people are just being preyed upon. Because like Patrick mentioned, a lot of times it doesn't seem to have any positive effects on people. It leaves them traumatized and fragmented.
Well, I think too, it's in terms of me being a contrarian person, I hear the I hear the love and light, positive experiences, and I say to myself, well, maybe there's a negative angle, and then I hear the negative experiences, and I say, well, maybe there's a positive angle.
Yeah. And I don't think you can cast it into, a total binary. This is a good spirit and this is a bad spirit. But I do think that it is worth looking at some of these experiences, not being wholly transformative. Perhaps they can be synthesized and transformative upon reflection later in life. But the actual experiences themselves can still be negative in an aspect.
Mm-hmm. Well put.
All right. We are out of time. It's been absolutely awesome having you back on, Patrick.
Oh, my pleasure, Seriah. I'm sorry I talked too much. I got overexcited talking to these eminent men.
I would listen to you for the entire show if you were the only one talking.
Yeah. Sure, you're only putting me on now.
Don't apologize, because you were the guest of honor. So I'm glad that you got a chance.
Well, thank you very much, guys, for putting up with me and for asking and saying such intelligent things. I wish we could have gone into it more. We never have enough time, really. We can always pre-Socratic philosophers, did we?
We can always do it again.
It's true.
And I highly recommend people pick up your books. Daimonic Reality, in particular, holds so much weight with this stuff. It's just an astonishing book. I haven't read your most recent novel, but now I want to, and I'm going to have to pick that up.
Without Daimonic Reality, know where the footprints end. It couldn't have happened without it.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, bye, guys.
All right, bye, Patrick.
Bye, everyone. Thanks very much for talking. Bye.
I'd like to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons, especially in this tough time. Your donations mean a lot. You are literally keeping this show going. So thank you so much. And an extra special thanks to those pledging $10 or more. Super Inframan, Allison Cook, Lindsay Trebet, Tim, Walker, Joanna Rojas, Maddie, David Moore, Vincent Trewell, The Great Change, Stone Wilderness, Luke Osborne, Becky Trainer, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Demian Tallman, Edu Kamahort, Tactical Therapist, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Maria, Sam Sheeran, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, John Rutledge Foster, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Sasha Jorg, Matthias Sunby, Dominic O'Malley, Christopher Vaughn, Riker and Stark, J. Otto Balut, Jose A., Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cicernos, Ray Benedetto, Lindsey Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Matthew Sproul, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Giaquinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Chris 646, Carla Mahoney, and James Lattimore. Thank you all so very much. All right, that was a long time coming. We've been trying to get Patrick and everything organized for a long time, and I'm really glad it finally happened. I hope it lived up to expectations. I know it did for us. It's always a pleasure to talk to Patrick Harpur. And if you haven't read, especially Daimonic Reality, you really need to pick that book up. It's just a fantastic piece of work. Now, there is an extra segment I did. The show ran a little long, so I stuck that extra bit about Panic in the Woods and other such related things as a Patreon segment. It's about 10, 15 minutes long, something like that. But like I said, it pushed the show a little bit long, so I cut that out just for Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to www.wheredidtheroadgo.com and click on the Patreon link. It's only $3 a month. You'll have access to all the old Patreon segments as well as new stuff. And I we'll see, start doing some short little bits on a fairly regular basis. We'll see how that goes, including some videos. Remember, we do have merch. That is also available on the website. I mean, everything is technically connected on the website, so go there and explore a lot of stuff. And we've gotten quite a few new patrons lately. I want to thank all of them for joining us and helping out. I hope you enjoy the content, the extra content that you'll get being Patreons. I have some interesting stuff planned, both for Patreons and the main show, so we'll see how life goes. I hope everyone is doing well out there, and staying safe. And I'll see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.